So the relationship between Sartre and theology is not widely studied. Sartre is one of the 20th century's most famous atheists, and for that reason I think that many people have not considered the possibility that he might have been theologically educated and that his atheism might not just be an atheism of indifference or an evidentialist atheism. Sartre's atheism is not the evidentialist atheism of someone like Bertrand Russell, who says that there's just not enough evidence. Instead, it's a very theologically informed atheism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sartre's biography and his philosophical education. That's going to require going into some depth about differences in French philosophical and British philosophical contexts in the period. And then I'll go on to discuss being and nothingness and the themes from Sartre's philosophy that became very influential in culture, in Western European and American culture, but also in theology and the reception of existentialism. So Sartre was born in Paris in 1905 to a Protestant Catholic family. So his mother was Anne-Marie Schweitzer and his father was Jean-Baptiste Sartre. And he grew up in the household of his grandparents, his mother's parents, the Schweitzers, because his father died when he was 2 years old. Now, Sartre's grandfather exerted a fairly profound influence over the young Sartre because he was a translator and publisher. And so in his autobiography, Sartre writes about being surrounded by books in multiple languages and sort of being inducted into what he called the priesthood of literature. So he grew up in a household where literature was highly valued, but he was also taken to mass by his mother and grandmother. And so the way he poses it, at least retrospectively, is that he was raised in a household with many possible values, some religious and some decidedly anti-clerical. So as a teenager in the 1920s, Sartre studied philosophy in Paris. He became interested in philosophy through the works of Henri Bergson, who's not widely read now, but whose book Time and Free Will intrigued Sartre and made him start thinking about questions of freedom and determinism. He also read older French philosophers of the canon, including people like Descartes and Pascal. And one thing that's noticeable, I think, in the English-speaking reception of Sartre, and one thing that my work has sought to redress, is that Sartre's interest in philosophy was well kindled before he encountered the phenomenological works of people like Husserl and Heidegger. So the English-speaking reception of Sartre largely sees him in this tradition of phenomenology, but there's another French tradition which is equally as important, I think, in understanding a work like Being and Nothingness, which we'll come on to. So as a university student, Sartre studied at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, which is the most prestigious philosophical training establishment that there is. He had access to the best kind of philosophical education that Paris had to offer. And he took the Aggregation, which is a qualifying exam in philosophy, for the first time in 1928, and he failed it. And he claimed that, or others claimed, it's never quite clear whether this is Sartre's line or someone else's, that he failed it because he was too original. The next year, however, he took it again after revising with a certain woman called Simone de Beauvoir, and he came in first place, and she came in second place. She was 21 at the time, and the youngest person ever to pass the Aggregation in philosophy. And in that year, a sort of legend was born about this intellectual power couple, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. And there is a lot of fictional legendary quality to the stories that are told about them. But it's true that throughout their careers, they read each other's works and they were brutal critics with each other and appreciated each other's brutal criticism for as long as they both lived. So in the 1920s, Sartre studied mysticism. He studied psychology and ethics. And it's worth noting that the disciplinary divisions of philosophy in Paris at the time included logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and psychology. So the empirical field of psychology was emerging at the time, but it was still considered to be a philosopher's purview to think about how the mind worked and what consciousness was, and to reflect on this from the subjective point of view and the faculties of things like the imagination and so on. So under this psychological interest of Sartre's, he studied Christian mystics, including Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And he, in fact, wrote a dissertation on the imagination under Henri Delacroix, who was someone with a specialist interest in mysticism. And that was never published, but it led to 2 publications in the 1930s. So there are several works that emerged between 1936 and 1943, when Being and Nothingness was published. 2 on the imagination. And this period of Sartre's works is usually referred to as the phenomenological period, because in 1931 and 32 he did go to Berlin and he studied in the French Institute there. And in that period he was first exposed to the works of Heidegger and Husserl in great depth. He struggled with German, but he tried, and he came back, and then in the later 1930s began to write these phenomenological works. So there's one in particular that I want to speak about at some length, which is the transcendence of the ego, because that work lays the foundation for a lot of the themes that he's going to go on to develop in Being and Nothingness. So in the transcendence of the ego, Sartre deals with a problem that he perceives in the Husserl's transcendental unity of apperception. So it's a problem that he sees in the history of philosophy, starting with the Cartesian cogito, raised a bit in Kant, and then in Husserl's phenomenology. And the problem is that he thinks that there's a difference between the I that thinks and the I that says I think. So he introduces a distinction between what he calls consciousness and reflective consciousness. So I'm going to spell this out a bit more in terms of Husserl's contribution and then give an example to clarify. So Husserl's philosophy includes a thesis called the intentionality thesis, which is that consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's directed at something. So when you are thinking, for example, you're usually thinking about something. There's an object, an intentional object in Husserlian language of your consciousness. But Sartre thinks that there's a distinction that we need to make between the thinking and the subject that thinks, because he says the I that says I think is precisely not the one that's thinking. There's a distance between that comes into existence with reflection. So to give you an example, academics generally are in the process of writing something, whether it's an article or a book, and when I am in the process of doing those things, whether it's writing, I might be conscious of the sound of the typing of the keys as I type. I might be conscious of the page as I read, but I'm not conscious of this action as mine until I reflect on it and perhaps tell someone else about it. So when I say to my husband at dinner, I worked on chapter 4 today. So Sartre doesn't want to deny that there's an ego at all, but what he wants to deny is that there's an ego behind consciousness as a subject. So when I am telling my husband that I've written a book, or that I'm writing chapter 3 today, I'm no longer the self that is writing chapter 3. I'm reflecting on that self at some distance. So Sartre thinks ultimately that the I, this subject, only comes into existence when we reflect on activity and see it as our own. And this becomes very important for his philosophy and for his view of personal identity. Now, if you use the word identity in philosophy, many people will go back to Aristotle's metaphysics, where Aristotle says that identity is the fact that a thing is itself. But when it comes to human beings, what does it mean to say that I am myself? I'm not myself in the same way that a rock is a rock. A rock might erode over time. A rock might give way to pressures or flame. But the way that human selves change seems to raise complications for what it means to claim identity with ourselves in the future or the past. So Sartre thinks that a lot of the kinds of explanations people use to explain their identities or to claim something as their own resort to either motives or causes to explain why someone is what they